What if I told you that your legs are not weak? What if the muscle you're standing on right now, the muscle that carries you up your stairs and out to your garden, is actually fine? What if the real problem isn't in your legs at all, but in the signal trying to reach them? I want you to picture something you've probably experienced and never had a name for. You go to stand up from your favorite chair, and for just a fraction of a second, your legs hesitate. They don't move the instant you tell them to. There's a strange half-beat delay, like the message left your brain but got stuck in traffic somewhere on the way down. Most people call that getting old. Most doctors call it sarcopenia and hand you a protein shake. I'm going to call it what it actually is, a wiring problem. And today I'm going to show you the 5 foods that don't just feed your muscles. They repair the wiring between your brain and your legs. Maybe you've noticed it stepping off a curb, that split second where your foot doesn't quite land where you expected. Maybe it's climbing out of the car, or turning quickly when someone calls your name and your legs feel like they're following a half step behind the rest of you. If any of that sounds familiar, stay with me, because what I'm about to explain will change the way you think about every meal you eat from this point forward. I'm Sarah, and for the past 2 decades I've worked at the intersection of nutrition and neurology, specifically studying how what we eat affects the nervous system as we age. And I have to tell you, the conversation around aging legs has been incomplete for a very long time. Here's the piece almost nobody talks about. Your muscle fibers don't move on their own. They are entirely dependent on a signal that begins in your brain, travels down your spinal cord, and arrives at your leg muscles through a structure called a motor neuron. Think of your muscle as a light bulb and that motor neuron as the wire feeding it electricity. The bulb can be perfectly good, but if the wire is frayed, flickering, or sending a weaker current than it used to, the light dims anyway. As we age, we lose what neurologists call motor units, clusters of nerve fiber that control small groups of muscle fibers. The signal that does arrive slows down, and by the time a person reaches their 70s, the transmission speed along those pathways can be meaningfully reduced compared to their 30s. That's not muscle weakness in the traditional sense. That's a communication breakdown between 2 systems that used to talk to each other instantly, and are now negotiating through static. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to overstate this. I'm not telling you that muscle mass doesn't matter, or that exercise isn't important. Both absolutely are. What I am telling you is that the conversation has been one-sided for far too long, entirely focused on the muscle and almost silent on the wiring that controls it. That gap in the conversation is exactly what we're closing today. This isn't a theory I'm proposing to be provocative. This is measurable neurophysiology. And the exciting part, the part that changes everything, is that specific foods appear to directly support the health of this wiring system. Not just the muscle at the end of the line, but the entire electrical pathway that makes movement possible in the first place. So today we're going through 5 foods, ranked by how directly they support this brain-to-leg connection. And by the end, you'll understand why some people eat perfectly healthy diets and still shuffle across a room, while others eating far simpler meals move like they're 20 years younger than their birth certificate says. I also want to be upfront about something. This isn't a video about doing more. It's not about adding another supplement to a cabinet that's probably already crowded, or spending an hour a day on exercises you don't enjoy. It's about understanding that 5 specific ordinary foods you can find in any grocery store, appear to directly support the wiring that everything else depends on. Once you understand why, the rest becomes almost automatic. You stop thinking of your plate as fuel for a muscle. You start thinking of it as maintenance for an entire communication system, one that has kept you upright and moving for your whole life, and one that is still very much capable of being repaired. Let's start with beets and dark leafy greens, because they solve a problem most people have never considered: signal bandwidth. Here's what I mean. Every time your brain sends a move command down to your leg, that signal needs oxygen and blood flow to travel efficiently. Not just in the muscle itself, but in the neural tissue and the motor pathways that carry the instruction. Nitric oxide is the molecule that keeps those pathways open, flexible, and responsive. Think of it as the difference between a smooth 2-lane highway and a road full of potholes. The car can be in perfect condition, but if the road is degraded, the trip takes longer, and sometimes the car doesn't arrive at all. After the age of 70, the body's natural ability to recycle nitric oxide drops substantially, and this doesn't just affect blood flow to muscle tissue. It affects blood flow to the very regions of the brain responsible for motor control and coordination. There's a study conducted at a major American research university that tracked older adults consuming the nitrate equivalent of 2 medium beets before physical activity. The researchers weren't just measuring leg strength. They were measuring blood flow to the white matter regions of the brain associated with movement planning and control. And what they found was striking: a significant increase in blood flow to exactly those regions. In other words, beets weren't just feeding the muscle, they were feeding the part of the brain, giving the muscle its orders. This is the piece that gets lost when we only talk about muscle nutrition. You can eat all the protein in the world, but if the signal telling that protein-rich muscle when and how to fire is degraded, you're building an engine with a broken ignition. Here's a way to picture it that might make this click. Imagine a highly trained orchestra, every musician technically excellent, instruments perfectly tuned. Now imagine the conductor is standing behind a thick pane of foggy glass, gesturing instructions the musicians can only half see. The orchestra hasn't lost any skill, but the timing falls apart, the entrances get muddled, the whole performance feels sluggish even though every individual player is capable. That foggy glass is what reduced nitric oxide availability does to the pathway between your brain and your legs. The musicians, your muscle fibers, are still there. The conductor, your motor cortex, is still capable. It's the visibility between them that's degraded. Dark leafy greens work through the same nitrate pathway, but with an added benefit. They're rich in magnesium, a mineral required for the nerve impulses that allow motor neurons to fire cleanly in the first place. When magnesium runs low, which happens in a majority of older adults, nerve signals can misfire or fire inconsistently, which is part of why so many people experience nighttime leg cramps and that strange involuntary curling of the toes. That's not a muscle malfunction. That's a nerve, denied the mineral it needs, sending a garbled instruction. I had a patient, Dorothy, 79 years old, who described her legs as having a mind of their own. She'd tell them to step forward smoothly, and instead they'd sort of lurch. We added roasted beets and sautéed greens to her routine 4 days a week, cooked with a bit of olive oil to help her body absorb the fat-soluble compounds alongside them. Within 10 weeks, she told me the lurching sensation had almost completely disappeared. She described it as finally getting a straight answer from my own body. For practical use, roast beets around 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 to 60 minutes to concentrate the nitrates without breaking them down. Boiling for extended periods leaches the water-soluble nitrates out into the cooking water, so roasting or a quick steam is far better. Pair beets with a splash of citrus, since vitamin C meaningfully improves how efficiently your body converts those nitrates into usable nitric oxide. And for leafy greens, cook them in a real fat. Olive oil is ideal, because several of their protective compounds are fat-soluble and pass right through you unabsorbed if eaten dry. I want to address something directly here, because I know a few of you are thinking it. I already eat salads. Why hasn't this fixed my legs already? The honest answer is portion and consistency. A few leaves of lettuce tucked under a sandwich once a week doesn't come close to the nitrate concentration used in the research I just described. We're talking about a genuinely generous cooked serving most days of the week, not a garnish. Food as maintenance only works when it's dosed like maintenance, not decoration. Now let's talk about wild-caught salmon, because this is where the wiring metaphor becomes almost literal. Every nerve fiber in your body, including the long motor neurons running from your spinal cord down to your calves and feet, is wrapped in a protective sheath called myelin. Myelin is essentially biological insulation. It's what allows an electrical signal to travel down a nerve fiber quickly and cleanly, instead of leaking energy out along the way, the same way insulation on an electrical wire keeps the current moving efficiently to its destination instead of dissipating into the surrounding air. As we age, that myelin sheath can thin and degrade, particularly along the longest nerve pathways in the body, which happen to be the ones running to your legs and feet. This is part of why numbness, tingling, and that delayed feeling in the lower legs becomes more common with age. It isn't always about circulation. Often, it's about insulation. Omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and DHA, are structural components your body uses to build and maintain that myelin sheath. Salmon happens to be one of the richest dietary sources available. A study out of a Scottish research institution followed adults over 65 for 18 weeks, and the group consuming the omega-3 equivalent of roughly 3 servings of wild salmon per week showed meaningfully better outcomes on measures tied to nerve-muscle communication, not just muscle mass itself. The muscle tissue mattered less than how efficiently the signal reaching it was transmitted. I also want to gently correct something well-meaning people often say to those with numb or tingling feet. That's just poor circulation. It comes with age. Circulation is part of the picture, but it's incomplete. You can have perfectly adequate blood flow and still experience numbness if the insulating sheath around the nerve itself has thinned. Blaming circulation alone means people spend years focused on the wrong target, walking more, elevating their feet, when the missing piece was sitting in a grocery store seafood case the whole time. There's a second piece here that matters enormously for older adults: vitamin D3. Your skin loses much of its ability to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight as you age, and vitamin D plays a direct role in motor neuron health and in the sensitivity of the receptors where nerve meets muscle. Low vitamin D is strongly associated with poor balance and slower reaction time when the body needs to catch itself, which is precisely the mechanism behind a huge number of falls. Wild salmon is one of the few foods that delivers a meaningful dose of D3 in a single serving. I think of one patient, Harold, 76, a retired mechanic who told me his feet felt like they were wearing thick socks all the time, even when they weren't. That description is almost a textbook depiction of reduced sensory motor signal quality. We introduced wild salmon into his diet 2 to 3 times weekly. Around the 8-week mark, he told me the sock sensation had faded by more than half, and he'd started noticing his footing on stairs felt more certain. Practical guidance: choose wild-caught over farm-raised whenever possible, since the ratio of beneficial to inflammatory fats differs meaningfully between the two, and farmed salmon simply doesn't deliver the same nerve protective profile. 2 to 3 servings a week is a reasonable target. Pairing salmon with leafy greens isn't just a flavor choice. The vitamin K found in greens works synergistically with the fat-soluble nutrients in salmon. It's worth pausing on why this particular piece of biology matters so much for balance specifically. When you trip or step on an uneven surface, your body doesn't have time to consciously think its way through a correction. That correction has to travel down a well-insulated nerve pathway almost instantly, faster than conscious thought, to fire the right muscles in the right order before you fall. A thinning myelin sheath doesn't just slow things down, it can introduce a kind of static into that emergency signal, the exact moment when speed and clarity matter most. So when we talk about omega-3s and myelin, we're not just talking about comfort or sensation. We're talking about the biological hardware behind your ability to catch yourself. Now to eggs, and this is where we arrive at perhaps the single most overlooked structure in this entire conversation: the neuromuscular junction. Here's what that is. Your motor neuron doesn't actually touch your muscle fiber directly. There's a tiny gap between the two, and for the signal to cross that gap, your body releases a chemical messenger called acetylcholine. Think of the neuromuscular junction as a relay handoff in a race. The nerve carries the baton most of the way, but at the final moment, it has to physically pass it across a gap to the muscle. If that handoff is fumbled, even a perfectly healthy nerve and a perfectly healthy muscle fail to connect. Choline, found abundantly in egg yolks, is the raw material your body uses to manufacture acetylcholine. Without adequate choline, that handoff becomes less reliable. This is a piece of biology that gets completely lost when eggs are discussed only in terms of protein or cholesterol. The yolk isn't incidental. It's arguably the most functionally important part of the egg for this specific purpose, and it's the part people have been throwing away for decades based on outdated advice. Most people have never even heard the term neuromuscular junction, and I understand why. It's not exactly dinner table conversation. But once you understand it, so much of what happens with aging legs suddenly makes sense. It explains why 2 people can have nearly identical muscle mass on a scan, and yet one moves with confidence while the other hesitates and second-guesses every step. The difference often isn't the muscle. It's the reliability of the handoff happening thousands of times a day, every time you shift your weight, adjust your balance, or take a single step forward. Then there's leucine, the amino acid most associated with muscle protein synthesis. After the age of 65, the body develops something researchers term anabolic resistance, meaning muscle tissue becomes less responsive to ordinary protein intake and requires a stronger trigger to respond at all. Leucine functions as that trigger. 2 whole eggs deliver a meaningful dose, enough that research out of a major Midwestern university found it sufficient to stimulate muscle protein synthesis even in older adults with substantial anabolic resistance. But here's the reframe that matters. It's not enough to build muscle tissue if the handoff point delivering instructions to that tissue is unreliable. You need both. The leucine builds the receiver. The choline builds the reliability of the message reaching it. I worked with a patient, Margaret, 74, after her second fall in 6 months. She'd avoided eggs for over a decade on the advice of an older physician, terrified of cholesterol. We reintroduced 2 to 3 whole eggs daily, cooked gently to preserve the delicate proteins. Within 8 weeks, she told me she'd climbed her staircase without gripping the railing for the first time in 2 years. What changed wasn't just her muscle. It was, in all likelihood, the reliability of the signal telling that muscle exactly when and how hard to contract. For best results, 2 to 3 whole eggs in the morning, gently cooked rather than seared in a dry, high-heat pan, paired with a small amount of healthy fat to help absorb the fat-soluble nutrients carried in the yolk. I know some of you were raised on the advice to separate the whites from the yolk, to build an omelet out of egg whites alone in the name of heart health. I understand where that advice came from, but from a neuromuscular standpoint, it strips out almost everything we've just discussed. The white gives you protein. The yolk gives you the choline that makes that protein signal usable in the first place. Throwing away the yolk is a bit like buying a phone and refusing to charge it. The hardware is there, it simply never gets powered on. Now, Greek yogurt, and this is where the story gets genuinely surprising, because your gut turns out to be involved in this wiring system too. Researchers now describe something called the gut-muscle axis, and increasingly, scientists are extending that concept to include the brain, forming what's being studied as a gut-brain muscle axis. Here's the short version. The trillions of bacteria living in your digestive tract don't just break down food. They manufacture neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that influence everything from mood to motor coordination, and they communicate with your brain via the vagus nerve, a direct neural highway connecting gut and brain. As the gut microbiome becomes less diverse with age, which happens to most people to some degree, that communication becomes less efficient. Some researchers believe this may contribute to the subtle coordination decline many older adults notice. That sense that movements which used to be automatic now require a bit more conscious effort. The vagus nerve itself is worth pausing on for a moment, because it's one of the longest nerves in the body, running from the brainstem down through the chest and into the abdomen, touching nearly every major organ along the way. It's sometimes called the body's information superhighway, carrying far more signals upward from the gut to the brain than downward. When the bacterial population feeding into that highway becomes less diverse, the quality of information traveling along it changes too. And some researchers believe this may subtly affect the brain regions involved in coordinating smooth, confident movement. Greek yogurt, specifically the plain, full-fat variety with live active cultures, helps restore diversity to that gut population. Research out of a University of California campus found that a healthier, more diverse gut microbiome in older adults correlated not just with better muscle mass, but with better coordination and faster physical recovery after exertion. Outcomes that point toward improved signal transmission along that gut-brain axis, not simply bigger muscles. There's also the direct protein contribution to consider. A cup of plain, full-fat Greek yogurt delivers around 17 to 20 grams of highly bioavailable protein, including a strong profile of branched-chain amino acids that muscle tissue absorbs efficiently. But given everything we've just discussed, I'd encourage you to think of Greek yogurt less as a protein snack and more as maintenance for an entire communication network, one that happens to run straight through your digestive system. One patient of mine, Robert, 71, described his legs as feeling filled with concrete every morning. We added 2 cups of sautéed spinach and a serving of Greek yogurt daily. 6 weeks later, the concrete feeling had lifted. He was walking his old mail delivery route again, this time purely for the joy of it. For best results, eat your Greek yogurt within 30 to 45 minutes of any physical activity. Even a short walk counts, since this window appears to be when the body is most receptive to using these nutrients efficiently. Choose plain, full-fat versions rather than low-fat, since low-fat versions typically replace the removed fat with added sugar, which works against everything we're trying to accomplish here. I find this connection genuinely remarkable and honestly a little humbling. We tend to think of digestion and movement as 2 entirely separate systems, one below the belt, one below the neck, and never the 2 shall meet. But the body doesn't organize itself into the neat categories we use in textbooks. Your gut is in constant conversation with your brain, and your brain is in constant conversation with your legs. Support one link in that chain, and the effects ripple further than you'd expect. And now, the food I consider the most quietly powerful of all, extra virgin olive oil. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone I share it with. The motor neuron running from your lower spine down to your foot is, cell for cell, among the longest single cells in the entire human body, in some people stretching over a meter in length. That single cell has to maintain its structure, generate energy, and transmit a clean electrical signal along its entire length every single day for decades. That is an extraordinary metabolic demand, and it depends heavily on the health of the mitochondria, the energy-generating structures packed along that nerve fiber. Extra virgin olive oil contains a polyphenol called hydroxytyrosol, and research out of a university in Spain has found that this compound helps protect mitochondrial DNA in nerve and muscle cells from oxidative damage. As we age, that DNA accumulates small errors, not unlike a document that's been photocopied one too many times. The edges blur, some instructions get lost. Damaged mitochondria along a motor neuron mean less energy available to fire that signal cleanly across its full length, which may be part of why the delay so many older adults feel isn't imagined. It may be a literal energy shortfall along an extraordinarily long and demanding cell. To put the energy demand in perspective, consider that this single motor neuron, running the length of your leg, has to maintain its own internal transport system, ferrying nutrients and cellular machinery from the cell body near your spine, all the way down to the very tip of the nerve near your toes. This distance on a cellular scale is roughly equivalent to a human being walking the length of several football fields. That transport system runs almost entirely on the energy produced by mitochondria stationed along the way. When those mitochondria are damaged by oxidative stress, that transport slows, and the nerve's ability to maintain itself, let alone fire a clean signal, suffers accordingly. Olive oil also contains oleocanthal, a polyphenol that functions similarly to ibuprofen in the body, inhibiting the same inflammatory pathways, without the same long-term risks to the kidneys or digestive tract that come with regular anti-inflammatory medication use. Chronic low-grade inflammation doesn't just affect muscle tissue, it affects nerve tissue too, and a landmark study out of a university in Athens followed over 800 adults over 65 for 3 years, finding that those consuming roughly 4 tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil daily showed a substantially lower incidence of significant muscle loss compared to those who rarely consumed it. I want to tell you about Thomas, 81, a retired Navy commander who came to me unable to walk more than 2 blocks without stopping. He'd avoided dietary fat for 30 years based on outdated guidelines from decades earlier. We introduced 4 tablespoons of high-quality extra virgin olive oil into his daily routine, 2 in the morning, 2 at midday. We changed nothing else for the first month. At 6 weeks, he walked 4 blocks without stopping. By 6 months, he completed a 2-mile charity walk and sent me a photograph from the finish line. It hangs on my office wall today. For practical use, 4 tablespoons daily is a reasonable evidence-based target, used as your primary cooking fat for low to medium heat, or drizzled generously over vegetables, eggs, and fish. Buy it in dark glass bottles from reputable producers and look for a harvest date, rather than only an expiration date, since polyphenol content degrades meaningfully with time and light exposure. Fresh olive oil functions almost like medicine. Old, clear-bottled, bargain shelf oil is essentially just fat, stripped of the compounds that make it worth using in the first place. There's something almost poetic about closing this list on olive oil. It doesn't build muscle in any dramatic, visible way, and it will never make for a flashy headline the way a protein powder does. But if the motor neuron running down your leg really is one of the longest, hardest working cells in your entire body, then protecting it isn't a minor addition to your diet. It might be the single most important thing you do for it. The quiet workhorse deserves the quiet, unglamorous fat that keeps it running. Before we wrap up, it's worth saying plainly that none of these 5 foods work in isolation, and I don't want you walking away thinking you need to pick just one. The nitric oxide from beets widens the road. The omega-3s from salmon insulate the wire running down it. The choline from eggs makes sure the message actually crosses the final gap into the muscle. The cultures in Greek yogurt keep the broader communication network, gut to brain to muscle, functioning as intended. And the polyphenols in olive oil protect the actual cellular hardware carrying all of this, day after day, for years. Remove any one piece and the rest still work, just less efficiently, like a relay team missing one runner. Combine all 5 consistently, and you're not treating a single symptom. You're maintaining an entire system, from the top of your spine to the tip of your toes. Here's what I want you to walk away with today. These 5 foods aren't simply feeding your muscles. Beets and leafy greens widen the pathway your signal travels through. Salmon insulates the wire itself. Eggs power the handoff point where nerve meets muscle. Greek yogurt maintains an entire communication relay running through your gut. And olive oil protects the very cell doing the longest, hardest job in your entire nervous system. This is also why so many people eat what looks like a perfectly healthy, high-protein diet and still find their legs feeling distant, delayed, unreliable. They've been feeding the muscle at the end of the line while ignoring the wiring that gets the message there in the first place. You can have the strongest muscle fibers in the world, and if the signal telling them to fire is weak, delayed, or degraded, that strength never fully arrives where you need it. Your legs were never broken. The connection between your brain and your legs simply needs the raw materials to stay clear, fast, and reliable. And the extraordinary thing is, that connection retains its capacity to repair itself well into your 80s and beyond. It is not waiting for permission. It is waiting for ingredients. Think back to that half-second hesitation I described at the very start. The moment you tell your legs to move and they answer a beat too late. That delay isn't a verdict on your age. It's a signal, quite literally, asking for better conditions to travel through. Every plate you build from here forward is an opportunity to shorten that delay, to clear that static, to hand your nervous system exactly what it needs to do the job it was designed to do. This isn't about chasing the body you had at 30. It's about giving the body you have now the clearest possible line of communication with itself. I want to ask you something specific, more specific than usual. Have you ever felt that half-second hesitation, that moment where you told your legs to move and they answered just a beat too late? Describe it in the comments exactly as it happens for you. I read every single one, and understanding precisely how this shows up for different people helps me figure out what to cover next. If any part of what you heard today matched something you've been feeling but couldn't quite explain, that hesitation, that half-beat delay, that sense of your legs being a step behind your intention, tap the like button before you go. It's a small action, but it's the single biggest signal that tells this platform to put accurate information like this in front of more people who need it, instead of another recycled list of superfoods with no explanation behind it. And speaking of what's next, this is only half the picture. Nutrition rebuilds the wiring, but there's a specific category of movement that actually strengthens the signal traveling through it, something most people your age have never been shown. If you're not subscribed yet, now is the time, because that's exactly what we're covering in the next video. One more thing before you go. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who wants the real explanation, not just a quick fix, and that tells me you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Every week, I break down the biology behind aging in a way that actually respects your intelligence. No fear tactics, no miracle claims, just the science, explained clearly enough that you can use it starting today. Until then, feed the whole system, not just the muscle. Your legs aren't waiting for a miracle. They're waiting for a clear signal.